Two Doors Down. It's about time.
Maya Angelou tells us life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away.
Join us as we unravel the intricacies of lifetimes. Let's delve into these powerful narratives and discover how they contribute to the broader conversation about time and transformation.
Chris, about 2 years ago, I don't know if you remember me talking about this, but I went to a book signing in Washington, D.C. The author's name was Thomas Dibdall, and he had just published a book called When Innocence Is Not Enough. I thought it would be a really interesting conversation, and it was. Next to me sat a well-dressed and polished black man. I assumed he was a pastor.
A pastor. That sort of reminds me of this book that I picked up recently. It's called The Measure of a Man, a Spiritual Autobiography. It was written by Sidney Poitier. It was a New York Times bestseller, and he was a pretty big actor back in the day, 50s, 60s, 70s. In the introduction, I just like this. This was the opening of how he wrote. Many years ago, I wrote a book about my life, which was necessarily, in large part, a book about my life in Hollywood. More recently, I decided that I wanted to write a book about life, just life itself. What I've learned by living more than 70 years of it. What I absorbed through my early experiences in a certain time and place, and what I absorbed, certainly without knowing it, through the blood of my parents and through the blood of their parents before them.
Wow, that's pretty cool. That really does relate a lot more to this story than maybe you realize. When I listened to the author talk about his book, I learned of a 1984 murder in an alley off H Street in Washington, D.C., where 7 young men, aged 16 to 24, were arrested for this murder and rape. No evidence tied them to the crime. And later it was learned that evidence that would have tied another man to the crime was purposely hidden from the defense. That's the topic of this book. It was about the Brady Law and its failure to make defenses fair. The Brady Law was passed and required the prosecutors to provide all the information they had on the case to the defensive team. And in this case, they had evidence. They had 3 witnesses who saw this man leaving the scene of the crime, but they never even questioned him or considered him as a suspect because at that time in 1984, this whole social anger against gangs was in effect.
Well, not just gangs, but also the whole war on drugs is really kind of the base of
That's
it.
true. That's
which is
true.
a failed experiment,
Yes.
we all know.
Yes, it is. But society was pushing the police to take a stand against gang violence and make something happen. And so the detectives convinced themselves that this particular murder was done by a gang. And so they didn't even want to consider this single man that witnesses saw leaving the scene of the crime. Instead, they actually arrested 17 kids and they convicted 7 of them of this murder.
So it was a whole gang of, and all the kids that they arrested were all black.
Yes.
And they're all like teenagers.
Yes. The youngest was 16, the oldest was 24.
And they're claiming that they raped and killed and pummeled this woman with a pipe and sodomized her with a pipe and a bunch of other stuff.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
That's the story,
And
right?
the detectives presented this picture that they were convinced that there had to be like 20 to 25 gang members involved in this murder, and that most of them were standing around and watching and applauding and cheering. There was no evidence to support that.
So the incompetent police are ignoring some evidence and pursuing others.
Yes.
And they have already made up their mind that it's this bunch of black kids that did it.
Yes, and they had already presented to the press their theory of this gang murder, and the newspapers wrote bunch of articles about it. And
of course, the media just runs with it.
Right.
Right.
And so at the point where they thought perhaps they had this evidence about this other man, they didn't want to go pursue it because then they'd had to tell the media that all these other stories they fed them were wrong. So the thing that I was stunned to learn, though, was that the dapper man sitting next to me was one of the men, one of these 7 men who had been arrested for this murder. And he served his full sentence for a murder he didn't commit.
Oh, that answers my question. I was wondering, so how is this guy sitting next to you if he was convicted of murder? But he actually did the whole sentence?
He did his whole sentence. He served 24 years. And the interesting thing is that all of these men, the prosecutors and the detectives were so eager to convict them of this murder that they offered them all plea deals. And they were going to give them 6 to 10 years if they would plead guilty because they didn't want to take it to trial. They knew they didn't have a case. And none of these boys would take a plea deal because they said they would not admit to something they didn't do. And they said they didn't want mercy, they wanted justice. And justice was not saying you had killed someone when you in fact didn't. So every single one of them, all 7 of them, served their entire prison sentences, except for one of them who died behind bars of a brain aneurysm.
Wow,
so their whole lives were taken away from them.
Tell me what you shared a story with me about this, where the first boy that they interrogated, they pulled him in and tell that story.
The first boy that they interrogated was 16 years old, and he had a somewhat lower IQ. They pulled him in and they interrogated him for hours. I think I might have read it was like 14 hours or something. It was a long time without a parent, and he was only 16 years old. They interrogated him, and he wanted his mother. He just kept asking for his mother, and they finally told him, if you tell us that you and your friends committed this murder, we'll let you go home to your mother. She's waiting right outside this room for you. And so he did what they asked him to do. And then they put handcuffs on him and arrested him. And, you know, he was confused and he was exhausted, and he was a minor who by law should have had his parent present when he was being questioned. And they took advantage of his lower IQ and his exhaustion and his age and just railroaded him into implicating everybody. And then later he recanted and said that that isn't true. He just said it because they told him he was going to get to see his mother. But of course, you know, that never works. They never let you take away something that you said.
Yeah, so it's not right. The way that police interrogate, especially when it's a kid, you know, it's a minor.
Yeah. All of these, I would consider all of them minors for the most part. The oldest one was 24. But their entire lives were taken away from them. I mean, the one who was 24 years old served 36 years before he got out. You know, and he said, and several of them said, I lost my ability to have children, you know, because by the time I got out of prison, I'm too old to be having children. So, you know, essentially the justice system took their entire lives away from them.
So this relates to our episode here in Dorrs Down, because all these gentlemen who clearly were innocent had their lifetimes taken away from them.
That's correct. And here's the really interesting thing. I could believe, and I wouldn't fault them for doing their time and coming out and being angry and want some, you know, retribution. You know, they were wronged. But since their release, every single one of them has become an advocate for prisoners. So when they hear word of someone being released from prison, they go with their own money and they buy them a cell phone and they show up to help them through this mess that you got to deal with when you get out of prison. And, you know, they give them a cell phone and they show them how to use it. And they all have jobs. They all have lives. They all have, you know, apartments in Washington, D.C. But they're nowhere near where they should have been. How are these men going to retire when they've had 34 years of their lives taken away, where they haven't been able to build up any retirement or any equity or any savings?
I'm surprised that these particular guys were not institutionalized
I
after
was
being in
too.
prison for so long, that they would get out and be so well dressed and so well mannered and join movements to make a difference in their communities. All that's pretty extraordinary.
Christopher Turner, I think we can give him a lot of credit for that. Christopher Turner was the person sitting next to me. Since he's gotten out, he's been on the board of the Mid-Atlantic Innocent Project, which works to prevent and overturn convictions of innocent people. He and the rest of his friends who served time with him, they've created a book club called Free Minds, which is, to help incarcerated youth with a writing workshop. They have a book club for people who have just gotten out of prison where they can read books and discuss them. But the really interesting thing is, Chris told me, we struck up a conversation and we've actually become pretty good friends. I had them on my podcast. They're episode 6 of my podcast. And Thomas Dibdahl, the author who I went to listen to, is on episode 5 of my podcast. So you can learn more about their stories on Fierce Conversations with Toby. But one thing Chris told me is that he realized when he was in prison that he could be angry, or he could turn his life around and spend his time reading books and reading the Bible and learning about life and trying to be a better man. And sometimes some of these men were in the same prison and sometimes they weren't. But when they were, they would lift each other up when they were down and try to help each other through. So they really created a camaraderie to get them all through this.
So if I am not mistaken, there's been a request sent to Joe Biden, President of the United States, to pardon these gentlemen, even though they've already completed their sentences.
Yes.
Just out of principle, I agree.
Well, and they're on parole for life. And you know how hard it is to be on parole. You can't leave the state. You can't travel without a travel permit. I mean, there's all kinds of restrictions. And so, this would free them up to really live a normal life and to in some way give back something for the great wrong of what we've taken from them.
I got to tell you, I don't think there's any way to be put away in prison for all those years and then go to a normal life.
Well, you're probably right.
Anyway.
So, another interesting thing is there is a podcast about this particular case, and it's called The Alley. And it won some awards this year, but Chris and I, we just went to the Podcast Movement convention a couple of weeks ago, and we actually went into a breakout group for podcasts that are about social justice or trying to make a change. And standing right next to us was Shannon Lynch, and she was asked what her podcast was, and she said, "Oh, I did the Alley podcast." And I said, "Chris Turner and his group of 6." And, she's like, "What? How do you know him?" And I told her my whole story. So that was kind of interesting. But we're going to put a link to the Alley podcast, and we're also going to put links to some articles about their story and this petition for their pardon on our website. So you'll be able to go look at that information.
Interesting. Since we're talking about lifetimes this week, it only seems right that we talk about, Lifetime. The movie network. Specifically, Jailbreak Lovers.
Oh my gosh.
Jailbreak Lovers.
Isn't that a corny title?
A 2022 Lifetime movie based on the true story of a woman who helped an inmate escape from prison.
Oh my gosh.
The film follows a woman volunteer at a prison who falls hard for John Maynard, convicted of felony murder. Drunk on passion, they did the unthinkable. What did you think of the movie, Toby?
Oh my gosh. I didn't know they were making this movie. I didn't know anything about it till some press release came out 6 weeks before the movie was going to be released. And it said my name in it. This is the story of Toby Dorr. And it's like, wait, what? How do they have my story? And I wasn't prepared. So my book was in process of being published at the time. We had to move the publishing date up because we wanted it to be out when the movie came out. And I had no idea what was going to be in the movie. I watched it just like everyone else. And it's so weird to sit and watch your life unfold on a TV screen when you don't even know what they're going to put up next. And you were there, and Kevin was there, and how embarrassing to have the romantic scenes when your stepson's sitting there going, Toby. It was really weird.
Yeah, and I think this reminds me. We talked about this a little bit earlier today. That what would have happened when those 50 officers tracked you down out on the freeway? What would have happened had the officers that were forcing you off of the highway into a tree at 100 miles an hour and then went and apprehended you with all those guns, all those weapons, and the fact that John Maynard was convicted of felony murder, and everybody was amped up on their super adrenaline, let's get him kind of guys thing going on. What would have happened had they shot and killed John Maynard?
Oh, John even told me, as they were when we were in the car chase, he said, Toby, they're going to try to shoot me. They're going to just take any excuse they can to shoot me. So, you just need to be aware of that. It was a very real possibility. And Chris, I'll bet if they shot John and killed him, that they would have arrested me for felony murder. And I'd be in prison today.
There's no doubt. There's absolutely no doubt. I mean, I think there's about 10 different felonies that you could be in the commission of when somebody dies, and you wind up being charged for felony murder. And one of them was aggravated escape.
Yeah, I saw that. I'm so glad I didn't know that at the time, or didn't think about that, because I would have been a nervous wreck. I mean, even if one of the policemen had gotten killed in the car chase, because it was a crazy high-speed chase. So, I think, though, I want to share, I have my prison Bible here that's got all kinds of marks in it. And I think this really kind of sums up my story. It's Ecclesiastes 3.
Ecclesiastes, yeah.
For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. I think in my life, I planted so many things, and when I realized I needed to do something drastic, to do something different, I kind of ripped up all that stuff that I'd spent all those years planting. And, while I was in prison, it was a time to break down and a time to build up. I really used that time to tear down everything I'd ever been, everything I ever was, and start from scratch and rebuild. It was a time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. One of the lessons I learned through this whole thing is that you can throw away things that aren't really lifting you up. You can let go of things. You don't have to keep everything surrounding you. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow. That's what my translation, my Bible in prison said. But another translation says a time to tear and a time to mend. And when I read that, I think of, towards the end of my prison sentence, I sent letters to the warden and, apologized to him and, tried to leave prison with, a clean slate, I think. It was a time to keep silent and a time to speak. And it did take me a while to get the courage to speak. And now, that's my mission in life, is to speak out and tell my story and tell some of the truths about the criminal justice system and about life, because I think that way everyone can learn from them.
I love that scripture.
I do too. I had it so circled and underlined in my prison Bible. I read it all the time.
That has so many powerful implications for every part of life. You don't have to be a felon convicted of escaping with your lover in Tennessee to enjoy that scripture.
Yeah.
So
what'd you think of the movie, Chris?
So I thought there were a bunch of things that I liked and didn't like about the movie. First off is I I have to say I was thrilled to see that somebody felt strongly enough about your story and about what it means to the world to actually produce something like that.
That's
so
true.
so that's good news.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I've seen the video of the police chase with
Uh-huh.
50 police cars and helicopters chasing a white pickup truck with you sitting in the passenger seat and John Maynard sitting behind the wheel at 100 miles an hour with semi trucks trying to force you off the road and you crashing through the bushes and all the police cars with all the dash cams chasing you and following. I've seen that whole video, and I know that the video that they put together in the movie was
It was like
ridiculously
about
woeful.
3 cars on a dirt road, and they just stopped and got out and held their hands up.
Yeah.
It's like, nah, that
Yeah.
not You missed the whole big part of the story.
So, if I'm not mistaken, I think what they were trying to do is just keep their production costs
Yes,
down by
I'm sure that
by
was it.
kind of cutting it short. But
Yeah.
really, the reality of what happened out there on the highway that night was a lot closer to what you'd expect a Hollywood movie to put out, which
well,
was
you know,
crazy
I
big.
am working with Wango Films right now, and we are doing a feature film and a 6-part docuseries about my life after prison.
That'll be fascinating to see if that comes to the big screen.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's our
so-
plan. And that one I'm involved in, so we will have a lot of those details in there that they left out.
So, do you think that movie, the big movie, you think that's going to be out in?
I don't know when.
You think maybe another year or so?
Well, that would be nice, but you know, I've learned that this whole movie thing takes a long time.
Yeah, well, they're working on it. So.
Yes, they are.
Well, I have another reading here. This is this is kind of interesting. My son bought me this book, I think, for Christmas.
I think
wasn't
he
it?
did, yeah.
And it's called Tools of Titans. And from what I understand, it's a really famous book. There's a lot of people that have just really gotten into this. So the author is a guy named Tim Ferriss. And I don't know anything about the guy. I didn't know anything about this book, but there's some pretty interesting things in here. When I was looking through, I actually found a whole segment where the author, Tim Ferriss, had done a podcast and spoke with author Brene Brown.
Ooh, I love Brene Brown.
And I knew you'd like this one,
I
Toby.
have 6 books of hers stacked here on my desk.
So Tim Ferriss asked, do you have any ask or question of my audience? And Brene responded, lean into discomfort, because I think these seemingly impossible problems that we have around race and homophobia and the environment and just the lack of love sometimes are not going to be solved in a comfortable way. So I guess my ask would be more of a big metaphysical ask. Give vulnerability a shot. Give discomfort its due, because I think he or she who is willing to be the most uncomfortable is not only the bravest, but rises the fastest.
Ooh, I love that. I love that. And you know, vulnerability was a huge lesson that I learned when I was in prison, because my story was just plastered all over the media. And so, you know, sometimes people say to me, I can't believe that you talk about these things. It's like, well, the media's already talked about them, so at least let me kind of clear them up and tell the real story behind them. I love vulnerability. I do think that vulnerability is so underrated, and it is a difficult thing, but it's so powerful. I think we should all embrace it.
It's difficult and powerful, I agree, but it's not just a little bit difficult.
It's
It is extremely difficult. I mean,
it is.
to put yourself in a situation where you expose yourself to ridicule. I mean, I don't know if there's anything that people are more terrified of than to feel belittled or ridiculed or humiliated. I mean, that's one of the big ones. It's why people fear public speaking.
Yes, I agree with that. And you know, maybe the media did me a favor by all the sensationalized stories they did, because it doesn't bother me now, because it's all been said, it's all been done. So
Yeah.
It just doesn't bother me anymore.
So I'm going to inject a little something into our episode here is that I mentioned this to you earlier, Toby. I am the catalyst. And what I mean is me, Christian Dorr. I am the catalyst. I am a sample of the American public that, I want just to give it some context is that life has kicked me in the face. Mm-hmm. And it's forced me to be very, very cautious about my meager resources, that I'm terrified that if I lose one little thing, I'm always living on the edge. I've always been a poor person. Financially, I just haven't had any money. You're a felon, and I've made plenty of mistakes myself. And today we live hand to mouth. We don't have any money in the bank, and we're one catastrophe, one transmission in the car that goes bad away from being practically homeless. We're just living on the edge all the time. And it's so frustrating to be like that, but at the same time, that's what causes me to be so conservative. And I just know that I'm a sample of a crosscut of America, and that if a white fat old guy that's a Navy veteran that is clearly on a conservative side, if I can feel that felony murder is something that needs to be done away with, then I believe that there's an awful lot of other people out there that feel the same way. Mm-hmm. And we need to get to some point, because what our nation needs is to end this insane law. This felony murder is just ridiculous. We have to get rid of it.
That's true. That's true. And we are going to talk a lot about felony murder shortly.
Later in the broadcast.
Right. Right. So, Chris, we're talking about lifetimes today. And we had a question between you and I about what is a lifetime. Do we each have one lifetime? Do we have multiple lifetimes? Is lifetime about the length of our life, about the time that we've lived? Or maybe I kind of think it's about the life that we live, about what we do with the time that we have, and not the measurement of the time. What do you think lifetimes are about?
I think this is sort of interesting because I did a bunch of research and I looked into what I thought was going to be interesting was lifespans, which is different than lifetimes, as I find out as I start reading a bit. But lifespans, kind of interesting because there's a span of there's a clump, I guess you could call it, of trees that are all growing, that scientists are curious that maybe this tree started as a single tree and then grew into more trees and more trees, and now there's a whole cluster of these trees. But they suspect that whole clump of trees is 80,000 years old.
Wow, that's amazing.
Now that's a lifespan.
That is a lifespan.
Now that's probably the oldest thing that we can refer to. But then there's animals. There's, for instance, a virus. No, I'm sorry, not a virus. A bacteria only lives for about 18 minutes.
Wow. And wreaks so much havoc.
Yes, right. Yeah. And they have found an organism, so a little bigger than what you call a virus or a bacteria, but they found an organism that's the smallest organism that you could ever imagine, is in a thermal vent at the bottom of the ocean off of the coast of Ireland.
Good grief.
And I looked into lifetimes for this thing, a lifespan of this thing, and as it turns out, they can't really study it. In order to
you can't
understand,
hardly take it out of its vent and bring it to the surface and study it, right?
And it's a parasite of sorts that it requires a host in order for it to gain whatever it needs to continue its life cycle.
Wow.
So it has a pretty short lifestyle. Mayflies.
Oh.
Mayflies live one day.
Wow.
But that's not true. They actually live for 2 or 3 years. But the first 2 or 3 years, they live as a nymph.
Oh.
So
in their adult stage, it's one day. Well, that's kind of like butterflies, except for monarch butterflies who make this big migration journey. But generally when they turn to butterflies, they just have a few weeks.
Ah, interesting. So they've got a short lifespan.
They do.
Turtles live a long time. Tortoises.
Elephants.
Yeah, elephants are pretty long, yeah. About the same as a person.
Yes.
And just, it's a doggone shame that dogs only live to be 7 or 10 years old.
Oh my gosh, Chris.
15 tops,
Yeah,
maybe. Every
yeah.
once in a while, a 20-year-old dog. But dogs, it's too bad that they would leave us just when we're getting really deeply in love with them, and then they have to pass away and we have to move on without them.
It's
a drag.
tough. It is tough.
So a lifespan is, it's really the time of life of a whole species, whereas lifetime is the period of time associated with an individual. So we experience a lifetime.
Well, I kind of want to interject here because I said earlier, do we have multiple lifetimes? And what I mean by that is, I feel like in my lifetime, I've had different lifetimes. There was a time in my life before my dad was burned when we had one type of a life. And then from the time my dad was burned until I was grown, we had a different kind of a life. So our life really changed significantly after my dad's accident. And then I had a life with my first husband, and then I was on the run on a prison escape, and that was a totally different life. And then my life today. So I don't know. Because I feel like I'm such a different person today than I was 20 years ago when I was planning a prison escape. I almost don't feel like I'm the same person at all.
You look exactly the same.
Well, no.
I can't tell the difference.
Well, you didn't know me 20 years ago. But you know what I'm asking? Have I lived multiple lifetimes? Have I lived my period during my life that have been so different that they're really different lifetimes? Or is it just...
Let me put it in my words. I think what you're saying is because when I first saw you reference this and multiple lifetimes, I was thinking like reincarnation and that kind of a thing, but that's not what you mean.
That's not what I'm talking about.
What you're talking about is within your 170-year period on this earth that you've had at least two and maybe several different experiences that were very, very different. The lifestyle was all different, and who you were living with and what was important to you is different, and everything else. And so your whole mindset is different.
Yes.
And I think probably there's lots of people that experience that.
I think so too.
I know that I
think so too. And so would you count that
as a lifetime?
As a lifetime? And I don't know. What's the word for that?
No, it's not a lifetime. Well, I don't think it's a lifetime.
Yeah,
but,
it's probably
do you
not.
think it is?
Well... No, but it feels like it. I mean, honestly, it feels like it was a different life, a different person. So, I don't know. It's a weird thing.
Interesting.
I think if we're lucky, we do experience a lot of those different periods in our life that feel like different lifetimes, because I think it means that you've lived your life well, or you've lived your life to the fullest because you've experienced so many different things.
Yeah, I suppose that's all true. So what's next on our agenda?
Well,
we want to hear from you. Lifetimes aren't just measured in years. They're shaped by the choices we make, the relationships we build, and the legacies we leave behind. Share your own reflections and stories using hashtag 2DoorsLifetimes and join the conversation about how we can make the most of the time we're given. Let's explore together what truly makes a lifetime meaningful. Here we are at our favorite part of the episode, felony murder.
Today I have a story for you that is quite different from any story we've had before. This is the story about Lakeith Smith. He's been behind bars since he was 15 years old.
Do we have an idea how old he is now?
Well, he was sentenced for convicted of felony murder in 2018.
2018. So he's been in prison or in jail for
6 years, something like that.
Yeah.
But prosecutors are certain that he didn't kill anyone. There's no question about that. Smith and a group of his friends were carried out a series of daytime burglaries in Alabama. They were primarily looking for TVs and game systems.
And the houses were empty.
That's
and
right.
These boys that were teenage boys were packing weapons.
Yes, they did have guns, which was a huge mistake. But they went into this one home where the family was on vacation. And the neighbor noticed a car in the driveway, and she knew that the family was on vacation, so she called the police. When the police got there, one of the boys, a 16-year-old boy named Aldante Washington, shot at the police. And then he exited the home and ran, but he had his gun with him, and the police officer shot and killed him. Prosecutors decided to charge Smith, along with the 3 other teens who took part in the burglary, with Washington's murder. The 3 other boys took a plea deal, served their time, and are out of prison now. In fact, some of them served sentences as short as 14 months. But
Wow.
Lakeith Smith refused a plea deal because he didn't want to admit liability for his friend's death. He just couldn't believe that they were trying to find him guilty of killing his friend.
So to recap here, we're talking about a bunch of teenage boys in a house packing guns. The police show up. There's an altercation. The police shoot and kill one of the teenage boys and then charge the other boys with that teenage
boy's murder. That's correct.
And one of those boys decides that he's not going to take a plea deal, and he gets sentenced to
65 years.
65 years.
His friends got 14 months because they took a plea deal.
Wow.
But he had the balls to take it to trial, and it made the prosecution mad enough that they threw the book at him.
Wow. So now there's this kid that not only did he not kill anybody, and he had a gun on him, but he
wasn't any more liable than the other boys.
Killed the boy that he's being charged with the murder for, and it was his own buddy, and he's going to prison for the murder of his own buddy. That is insane.
So, the exorbitant sentence that he got is a result of him exercising his Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial, which is in the Constitution. We are entitled to be represented or judged by a jury of our peers. But a lot of times when you're offered a plea deal and you choose to go the trial route because you believe you can win with the jury, the prosecution just throws the book at you. You just get unrealistic sentences.
So one of the characters in the aftermath of that event, of the murder, there's a woman named Liliana Gonzalez, and she took it upon herself to start a petition that has gone viral, and she has, hundreds of thousands of petitioners that are trying to help this Lakeith Smith to get him out of this situation, stop this felony murder thing that he's wrapped up in, and try to give him some sort of a life. Now, even if he still is convicted of a felony, it shouldn't be. This felony murder thing is just, I'm sorry, Toby, but it pisses me off.
Okay, well, that's okay. You can say that.
And so I think that there's really 3 approaches that we could take. You can do what Liliana Gonzalez is doing, which is petition for a specific individual and try and get him out of a situation that he's facing as far as felony murder goes. But the second way to do this is to just end felony murder as a systemic problem in our law books. Get rid of it altogether. Now, I'm not suggesting that by ending felony murder as a law on our law books that we would just open the gates and let everybody out that has ever been convicted of felony murder and they're now doing time.
Although there would be grounds for them to take their case back to court and try to get some reprieve.
And I'm okay with that, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that on a case-by-case basis, I think there'd be some people that should probably stay in prison,
Well,
and
there's
other
probably
people
some
that
people.
should get out.
Yeah.
But the bottom line here is that if we were to end felony murder, what I'm referring to is all of the felony murder instances that happen in the future.
That's right. We're
So-
trying to make a difference for the future.
So one more time, you can petition to get one person out, like Lakeith Smith and Liliana Gonzalez leading the charge. You can do what you and I are talking about doing, which is end the whole stinking thing about felony murder. Take it off the books altogether. All the rest of the countries in the world have
That's
already
right.
abolished this ridiculous thing.
That's right. And
So-
Australia still has it, but they've modified theirs significantly.
The
So,
third thing that we could do is to educate people, educate our youth especially.
a lot of the victims of felony murder, and when I say victims, they're the ones being convicted of felony murder, because I think that it's a crime to convict them when
The
they didn't
government
kill
is
someone.
committing a crime
But
against
most
them.
of those victims of felony murder are under the age of 20.
They're kids.
They're kids.
They're kids. They don't know
They
any
don't
better. They're doing
understand.
stupid
Yeah.
stuff that they shouldn't be doing, and they get wrapped up. And even if a buddy of theirs or a police officer shows up and kills one of their buddies, then the rest of them get nabbed for murder. I mean,
Yeah.
there's something wrong with that.
That's right. It is
So
wrong.
when I was a kid, my mom told me to respect the police. And I think this is fascinating because my mom was a felon. Funny, my wife is a felon, my mom is a felon. I wonder
Well-
if there's a trend going on
well,
here.
you know,
Anyway, so my mom was a felon, and she was a felon because she slapped a police officer. And then she goes on later in her years and she has me and tells me that, Chris, you have to respect police officers and cooperate. Be good to them. You know, call them yes, sir, and no, sir. You get pulled over, treat them respectfully.
well, I do think it's important to comply when they pull you over. You know they have the power to make your life miserable, so why give them any ammunition? You know, if they ask you to get out of your car, get out of your car. If they ask you to turn around, turn around. You know, it's not worth arguing over.
I went in the Navy, and in boot camp, my company commander told me that I didn't have to agree politically with my commander-in-chief, which I don't know if you knew about the chain of command in the military, but the top of my chain of command was a commander-in-chief, which is the president of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And my company commander in boot camp told me and all the rest of us, you don't have to agree with them politically, but you have to respect the office. It's the same thing that my mom told me, is that you're respecting the uniform.
Right.
You know, the police officer's uniform. So I get that. I get what people are trying to save me some sort of problems. But since then, you get kicked in the face by life enough, somewhere along the way, you just finally get to a point where you realize that, you know, police and prosecutors, they're drunk on their own power.
It is becoming that way, that's for sure.
And that it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be that way. When you dump all this into a soup, I just feel like there's no simple one correct answer. It gets to be really muddled and gray. It's a really muddy situation. So what I do know is that laws governing all people strips people of common sense. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that's right. Even judges. I mean, the title judge is about judgment.
That's right. And you should consider the facts of each case separately.
And use some common sense to apply to individual cases. Why should we have laws that are forcing judges to just apply a certain law and administer what they've been told to do? Why even bother having a judge? I just think that's ridiculous.
Right.
Well, I think we're closing in. Felony murder is a loophole because it doesn't require the prosecution to prove any intent. For those convicted of felony murder, the clock doesn't just tick, it steals. This part of our podcast is inspired by John Maynard, who was murdered by felony murder.
Join us next time on Dorrs Down as we continue to explore the unexpected ways time influences our decisions and how understanding these moments can reshape the course of our lives. Now it's time to draw a card from our basket and reveal the topic of our next episode. Let's see what time has in store for us.
Time as a healer.
Well, I think that might be
Woohoo!
a very uplifting and positive and healing thing.
Oh, I'm so healed. As we dive into the concept of lifetimes on this episode of Two Doors Down, we invite you to reflect on the moments that have defined your journey. Lifetimes aren't just measured in years. They're shaped by the choices we make, the relationships we build, and the legacies we leave behind. Share your own reflections and stories using hashtag 2DoorsLifetimes and join the conversation about how we can make the most of the time we're given. Let's explore together what truly makes a lifetime meaningful.
This is Christian and Toby Dorr, reminding you to make an impact with the moments you have. 2 Doors Down, it's about time. Or, in this episode, it might just be about life. Subscribe on YouTube at 2 Doors Down. For exclusive content, check out our Patreon channel, patreon.com/2doorsdown. Our website is 2doorsdown.com.
Until next time.